Greetings and welcome back to Mythic Memoirs, where we bring you the most fascinating and bone-chilling true crime stories from around the world. As always, we've scoured the archives to bring you a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat, so sit back, relax, and get ready to be transported into the dark and twisted world of true crime. The stories of notorious killers like the Black Dahlia murderer, the Manson family, and the Green River Killer offer us a glimpse into the darkest aspects of human behavior, and the complex and often difficult work of law enforcement and forensic experts to bring justice to victims and their families. In the following chapters, we will explore each of these cases in depth, from the beginnings of their reign of terror to the investigations that led to their arrests and trials. We will delve into the patterns and motivations of these killers, and examine the legacy of their crimes on American society and culture. Through these stories, we hope to shed light on the complexities of criminal investigations, the ways in which society responds to violent crime, and the importance of vigilance, innovation, and dedication in the fight against the darkest aspects of human behavior. Join us as we delve into the mines of darkness and explore the investigations that brought these notorious killers to justice. In the early 1980s, the tranquil community of King County, Washington was rocked by a series of grisly discoveries. The bodies of young women were turning up in and around the Green River, and authorities were left scratching their heads. Was this the work of a serial killer, or a string of isolated incidents? As the number of victims began to rise, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. The authorities scrambled to piece together the puzzle, but the killer was elusive and difficult to pin down. Fear and panic spread throughout the community, and tensions ran high as the investigation began in earnest. As the bodies continued to pile up, the investigators began to see patterns emerging in the killer's behavior. They noticed that he was targeting young women who were often involved in prostitution, and that he seemed to be very organized in his methods. The killer left few clues, making it difficult for investigators to build a profile of the suspect. Despite the challenges they faced, the investigators refused to give up. They combed through evidence with a fine-toothed comb, analyzing everything from tire tracks to DNA samples. They worked tirelessly, determined to bring the killer to justice and put an end to the terror that had gripped the community. But as the months turned into years, and the years turned into decades, the killer remained at large. Families of the victims were left to grieve without closure, and the community continued to live in fear. It would take over 20 years for the Green River Killer to be caught and brought to justice. But the story of his crimes and the investigation that followed remains a haunting reminder of the darkest side of humanity, and of the tireless work of those who seek to bring killers to justice. As the number of victims continued to rise, the investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes began in earnest. The authorities launched one of the largest and most complex investigations in American history, involving hundreds of law enforcement officials and forensic experts. The investigation team faced many challenges, as the killer was difficult to track and left few clues at the crime scenes. They began interviewing potential witnesses and suspects, analyzing evidence, and using the latest technology to help build a profile of the killer. The investigation team faced criticism from the public and the media, who were frustrated by the lack of progress in the case. The pressure to solve the case mounted, and the authorities struggled to keep up with the ever-growing list of victims. But despite the setbacks, the investigators refused to give up. They worked tirelessly, sifting through evidence and following leads. They developed new strategies and techniques to track down the killer, even as the investigation dragged on for years. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to identify patterns in the killer's behavior. They noticed that he was very careful in selecting his victims, often targeting young women who were involved in prostitution. They also discovered that he may have had some connection to the trucking industry. But even with this knowledge, the investigation team struggled to catch the killer. It seemed as though he was always one step ahead of them, and they were left to watch helplessly as the death toll continued to climb. Despite the frustration and setbacks, the investigation team remained determined to solve the case. They continued to work tirelessly, determined to bring the killer to justice and provide closure for the families of the victims. It would take years, but their dedication would ultimately pay off in the end. As the investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes continued, investigators began to identify patterns in the killer's behavior. They discovered that he had a type: young women who were often involved in prostitution. They also noted that he was extremely organized in his methods, often taking care to clean up after himself and avoid leaving any evidence at the crime scenes. The investigators also noticed that the killer would sometimes return to the bodies of his victims, often to rearrange them or to perform other gruesome acts. This indicated to the investigators that the killer had a compulsion or ritualistic aspect to his crimes. Using this information, investigators began to build a profile of the killer. They theorized that he may have had some connection to the trucking industry, as many of the victims were found near truck stops and highways. The investigators also began to focus their efforts on suspects who matched the profile of the killer. They conducted countless interviews and interrogations, and used the latest forensic technology to analyze evidence. But despite their efforts, the killer remained elusive. He seemed to be always one step ahead of them, and the investigators were left with more questions than answers. As the years went by, the investigation team was criticized for their lack of progress in the case. The families of the victims grew increasingly frustrated, and the community remained in fear of the killer, who was still at large. But the investigators refused to give up. They continued to work tirelessly, driven by their commitment to bringing the killer to justice and providing closure for the families of the victims. It would take years, but the investigators' perseverance would ultimately pay off. Through a combination of tireless work, advanced technology, and a stroke of luck, the Green River Killer would finally be caught and brought to justice. After years of investigation, the breakthrough in the Green River Killer case finally came in 2001. DNA evidence had been collected from some of the victims, but at the time, the technology was not advanced enough to conclusively identify a suspect. However, with advancements in DNA technology, investigators were able to re-examine the evidence and found a match to a man named Gary Ridgway. Ridgway had been a suspect early on in the investigation but was cleared due to lack of evidence. With the new DNA evidence, investigators were able to link Ridgway to the murders of at least 49 women. They arrested him in November 2001 and charged him with 4 counts of aggravated murder. At first, Ridgway denied any involvement in the killings, but eventually, he began to confess to some of the murders. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The arrest of the Green River Killer brought closure to the families of the victims and the community that had been living in fear for years. It also provided a sense of relief for the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case for so long. Despite the sense of closure, the investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes continues to this day. There may be more victims that have yet to be identified, and investigators are still working to piece together the full extent of Ridgway's crimes. But one thing is certain: the arrest of the Green River Killer was a major milestone in the fight against serial killers, and a testament to the hard work and dedication of the investigators who brought him to justice. The trial of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, began in 2003. the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Ridgway, including DNA evidence linking him to the murders of at least 48 women. During the trial, Ridgway's defense team argued that he should not be given the death penalty because he had cooperated with authorities and provided information about the murders. They also argued that he had a history of mental illness and had been abused as a child. The trial was emotionally charged, with the families of the victims sitting in the courtroom, listening to the horrific details of the murders. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard any details about their loved ones' deaths. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury found Ridgway guilty of 48 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial brought a sense of closure to the families of the victims, who had been waiting for justice for years. It also served as a reminder of the devastating impact that a serial killer can have on a community. But even after the trial, the investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes continued. Investigators worked to identify more victims and gather more evidence against Ridgway. Today, Gary Ridgway remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences for his heinous crimes. His case serves as a stark reminder of the need for diligent law enforcement and advances in forensic technology to bring justice to the victims of serial killers. The aftermath of the Green River Killer case was a mix of relief, closure, and continued questions. The families of the victims finally had some sense of closure, knowing that the man responsible for their loved ones' deaths was behind bars. But many of them were also left wondering if there were more victims out there that had not yet been identified. The case also had a significant impact on law enforcement and forensic science. The investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes was one of the longest and most complex in U.S. history, and it required a tremendous amount of resources and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The case also highlighted the importance of DNA evidence in solving crimes, and helped spur advancements in forensic technology that have been used to solve other cold cases in the years since. But perhaps the biggest impact of the Green River Killer case was on the community. For years, the people of the Pacific Northwest had lived in fear of the unknown killer who was targeting young women. The arrest and conviction of Gary Ridgway finally brought a sense of relief and closure to the community. Today, the legacy of the Green River Killer case lives on. It is a reminder of the devastation that a serial killer can cause, but also of the tireless work of law enforcement and forensic experts who are committed to bringing justice to victims and their families. As we look back on the case and the investigation into the Green River Killer's crimes, we are reminded of the importance of never giving up in the fight against serial killers, and of the need to continually advance and improve forensic technology to solve crimes and bring justice to those who have been harmed. The legacy of the Green River Killer case is one that has left an indelible mark on American culture and society. The case brought attention to the issue of serial killers and the devastating impact they can have on communities. It also highlighted the need for improved forensic technology and better coordination between law enforcement agencies. The case inspired books, movies, and TV shows, and has become a cultural touchstone for true crime enthusiasts. But beyond the entertainment value, the case has had a lasting impact on the way law enforcement approaches serial killers and violent crime. Today, the lessons learned from the Green River Killer case continue to shape law enforcement practices and procedures. The case has helped to improve communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies, and has led to advancements in forensic technology that have been used to solve other cold cases. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Green River Killer case is the reminder that justice can be served, even in the most complex and challenging cases. The tireless work of law enforcement and forensic experts, combined with the support of the community, can lead to the arrest and conviction of even the most elusive and dangerous criminals. As we look back on the legacy of the Green River Killer case, we are reminded of the importance of never giving up in the fight against violent crime, and of the need to continually improve and innovate in order to bring justice to victims and their families. The stories of notorious serial killers such as the BTK killer, the Manson family, and the Green River Killer are dark and disturbing, but they also offer important insights into the human psyche, the complexities of criminal investigations, and the ways in which society responds to violent crime. Through the chapters that explored the beginnings of each killer's reign of terror, the investigations that brought them to justice, and the aftermath of their crimes, we have seen how the tireless work of law enforcement, forensic experts, and the support of the community can bring justice to victims and their families. We have also seen the lasting impact that these cases have had on American culture and society, and the lessons that can be learned from them in terms of improving forensic technology and law enforcement practices. It is our hope that these stories serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, dedication, and innovation in the fight against violent crime, and that they offer a glimpse into the complexity of the human mind and the ways in which society responds to the darkest aspects of human behavior. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the minds of darkness and the investigations that brought some of the most notorious killers to justice. We hope that this exploration has shed light on the complexity of criminal investigations, the importance of forensic technology and law enforcement practices, and the impact that violent crime has on society and culture. If you found this video informative and engaging, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. We'd also love to hear your thoughts and opinions on these cases in the comments below. Remember, the fight against violent crime is ongoing, and it takes the vigilance, dedication, and innovation of all members of society to ensure that justice is served for victims and their families. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.